Under the flickering candlelight of a dark plantation bedroom, shadows stretched across ornate furniture and polished floors, yet the silence was heavy with unspoken horrors. They called it power. But behind locked doors, it mutated into something unspeakable, filthy, and obsessive. The world knows of the violence, the labor, the chains, but few have dared to speak of the private dominion over bodies, the intimate terror wielded with the casual cruelty of ownership. Enslaved women moved through these halls like ghosts, bound by law, custom, and fear. Every glance, every command, every act of forced proximity was a reminder that their bodies were no longer their own. What happened when ownership became obsession, when silence was the only law that mattered? The plantations of the 1700s and 1800s in the American South were empires of wealth built atop the suffering of human beings. Every column mansion, every manicured lawn was a monument to domination. The white master presided over his kingdom, while the enslaved were property in the fullest sense, breathing, laboring, reproducing under his absolute command. Wealth was measured in bodies. Every birth, every life, every child carried the imprint of enslavement. To refuse was to invite punishment. To resist meant the threat of sale, of separation, of violence. And within this oppressive hierarchy, the white mistress often exercised her own authority, enforcing domestic rules that maintained the power imbalance. But what happens when the man who owns lives begins to believe he owns the very bodies themselves? Control in this world was never only physical. Enslaved women were isolated, stripped of autonomy, and forced into domestic roles that brought them close to the master's private spaces, where power could be wielded in ways both subtle and cruel. Punishment was both a deterrent and a demonstration. If a woman resisted, her family could be beaten, sold, or humiliated. Masters twisted religion and law to justify their acts, framing ownership as divine or lawful right. When the law saw her as property, how could her screams ever be considered a crime? Every whispered warning passed between women, every secret hiding place in the shadows of the big house, became acts of survival against a system designed to erase her humanity. Behind the guise of household duty, in bedrooms, kitchens, and hidden quarters, the darkest abuses took place. Women called house servants were forced into intimate labor, proximity that allowed for coercion and manipulation. Diaries, letters, and slave narratives hint at the terror, recounting whispers and movements that the world never documented. Harriet Jacobs, in her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, revealed the relentless pursuit and the need to hide, describing a life in which each day required navigation of fear and survival. There were no witnesses, only walls that held secrets and whispers that still haunt the soil of the South. Imagine living each day knowing that survival depended on submission, that resistance could invite death or exile, that silence was not a choice but the only shield against brutality. The human cost was immeasurable. Women bore children fathered by their oppressors, raising them under watchful, hateful eyes. Trauma coursed through generations, carried not just in memory but in the patterns of fear, mistrust, and resilience embedded within families. Physical and emotional scars intertwined, creating legacies of grief that society refused to acknowledge. Imagine carrying both the child of your oppressor and the weight of your own shame, forced to sing in the fields as if nothing had happened. These weren't relationships, they were the filthiest crimes of power, buried beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. How many voices were lost because speaking meant death? Decades later, fragments of these silences surfaced through slave narratives collected by the WPA, through letters and diaries that had survived time. Many women refused to name the acts, constrained by shame or the lack of language to describe their ordeal. Historians reconstructed the truth from what remained, identifying a pattern of gendered racial violence that had been deliberately hidden. The system was designed to erase testimony, yet the archives, the oral histories, and now modern DNA studies spoke in its place. Even when the world was silent, the blood carried the story. It took over a century for these women's experiences to be fully acknowledged. The cultural reaction to these revelations has been slow and fraught. For generations, the myth of the benevolent master dominated textbooks, films, and public memory. Hollywood's romanticized plantations omitted sexual violence, sanitizing history for comfort. Black scholars, activists, and filmmakers began reclaiming the narratives, piecing together lives that had been erased, restoring dignity to those silenced. Every recovered name, every broken silence, became an act of rebellion against a history written by oppressors. But what drives a society to hide its dirtiest truths? Why do some histories remain buried for centuries while others are celebrated? The psychology of this abuse is stark. This was never about desire, it was about domination. Power, absolute and unmonitored, consumed morality. White supremacy justified ownership of both labor and body. Patriarchy devalued women entirely while elevating men to omnipotence, a power that rotted from within, producing obsession, cruelty, and the perversion of control. Even as white men fathered children with enslaved women, they clung to the illusion of racial purity, revealing a contradiction at the heart of the system. Ownership was obsession, obedience was survival, silence was life. Today, the echoes of these silences are palpable. Descendants walk through the ruins of plantations, reading names carved into wood, confronting a landscape of beauty and horror, intertwined. Fields that once bore the weight of labor now whisper stories of endurance, of trauma, of courage. The soil remembers what the books tried to forget. Every recovered diary, every oral account, every DNA revelation strengthens the connection to ancestors who endured unspeakable acts, who survived, who resisted in ways both subtle and profound. By acknowledging these histories, society not only honors those who suffered but interrogates the structures of power and domination that allowed such crimes to thrive. The haunting truth of slavery is not just the acts themselves, but the time they remain hidden. The silence was deliberate, a societal choice to protect pride and myth while condemning the vulnerable to erasure. Yet the persistence of memory, the courage of survivors, and the investigative work of scholars ensure that these stories can no longer be ignored. The disturbing reality is in how long the abuses stayed invisible, in how generations lived under the weight of secrets they could not name. Listening to the whispers of history, we can almost hear the voices that slavery tried to erase, and through them, understand the magnitude of endurance, the scope of injustice, and the resilience of humanity. The candlelight that first revealed the shadows of these plantation rooms now fades into dawn, casting a quiet glow over fields that remember. The women who endured sexual exploitation by white masters are no longer invisible. Their stories, once buried, now surface, demanding acknowledgement and justice. The soil still holds their stories. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the voices that slavery tried to erase, a chorus of survival, courage, and the relentless human spirit that refused to be silenced. Under the weight of centuries, the plantations continued to echo with the unspoken horrors inflicted behind closed doors. Each mansion, each polished floorboard, concealed secrets of obsession and control that shaped the lives of the enslaved in ways the public never saw. Women tasked with domestic duties were forced into constant proximity with men who claimed ownership over their bodies. Their labor was scrutinized, their movements monitored, their autonomy stripped away in ways that left lasting psychological scars. The term house servant became a euphemism for enforced intimacy, a label hiding the ugly truth of coercion and manipulation. The whispers of pain traveled silently between the walls, carrying stories of suffering and survival that would not be written in polite histories. Even the white mistresses, often seen as paragons of refinement, wielded their own authority with cruelty, punishing women who were perceived as rivals or threats. Jealousy, social expectation, and fear of scandal drove acts of humiliation, confinement, and even sale. Women bore the children of their oppressors, raising them under watchful eyes while grappling with the knowledge of their own subjugation. Each birth, each forced compliance, reinforced a system that dehumanized the most intimate aspects of life. Generations inherited not just labor, but trauma, fear, and a coded silence that bound them to the plantation even beyond emancipation. Historians today reconstruct these hidden abuses through fragmented narratives, letters, and court records. Documents reveal that sexual exploitation was not incidental, but a systematic part of maintaining dominance. Enslaved women endured constant negotiation between survival and resistance, often resorting to hiding, fleeing, or silently protesting in ways history cannot fully capture. The patterns are clear. Proximity to power was both a privilege and a trap, and the big house was a theater of control, obsession, and terror. Every enforced smile, every denied refusal, every silenced cry was a thread in a tapestry of domination that stretched across decades. Modern DNA studies and genealogical research have confirmed the physical legacy of this abuse, mapping the bloodlines of enslaved women who bore the children of their masters. These revelations provide irrefutable evidence of what the archives hint at: The most private and brutal crimes of slavery were deliberately hidden, sanctioned by law, and normalized by culture. The silence was intentional, crafted to maintain social order, protect reputation, and preserve wealth, while the women who endured these horrors were left to carry the physical and emotional consequences. Cultural memory in the post-slavery era often erased these stories. Southern literature, films, and school textbooks painted a picture of gentility, paternalism, and loyalty that masked the sexualized violence of plantation life. Myths of benevolent masters and loyal slaves persisted, comforting a society unwilling to confront the ugly intersections of race, gender, and power. Yet, Black scholars, activists, and descendants began reclaiming these narratives, piecing together the voices that had been silenced for generations. Each recovered testimony, each oral history, challenged the myths and restored a measure of dignity to the women whose lives had been controlled, violated, and erased. The psychological mechanisms behind this abuse were complex and deliberate. Ownership became obsession, power became lust, and legality became justification. Patriarchy and white supremacy intersected, creating a hierarchy in which enslaved women were considered both inferior and invisible, and the acts of sexual exploitation were cloaked in normalcy. Male desire was sanctioned, female suffering was invisible. Even within this structure, some women found ways to resist, protect children, or claim small victories of autonomy. Yet the system was relentless, its abuses pervasive, and its consequences generational. As descendants walk the remnants of these plantations today, they confront a landscape that holds both beauty and horror. Sunlight streaming across cotton fields, quiet hallways, and crumbling quarters serves as a reminder that history is layered, complex, and often concealed. Every field, every house, every tree bears witness to the lives endured in fear and silence. These ruins are not merely architectural, they are living memorials of trauma, resilience, and courage. By studying these histories, society confronts not only the violence of the past, but also the structures of oppression that allowed such acts to persist unseen. The echoes of these silences remain in modern life: generational trauma, inherited fear, and cultural memory that struggles to name what was endured. Yet the work of historians, genealogists, and storytellers ensures that the voices of enslaved women are no longer lost. By listening, acknowledging, and teaching these truths, we honor the resilience of those who survived, recognize the depth of injustice, and create a framework for reflection, healing, and justice. Their stories, once hidden, now demand attention, empathy, and remembrance. The candlelight that once revealed the horrors of a private, secret world now fades into a broader dawn. Descendants and scholars alike walk the plantations not only to mourn but to learn, not only to witness but to understand. The women who endured sexual exploitation by those who owned them are no longer invisible. Their struggles, their resistance, and their survival illuminate the depth of humanity, courage, and endurance in the face of unimaginable oppression. The soil holds their memory, the records, their testimony, and the living, their echo. History cannot ignore them any longer.